The pilot's voice carried through the first-class cabin with unmistakable authority, loud and commanding, as he addressed 42-year-old Captain Lisa Morgan, who was settling into seat 2A. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and exit the aircraft. We've received reports of a passenger creating a disturbance, and I don't tolerate disruptions on my flights." Lisa looked up from stowing her carry-on, her face showing confusion that was already starting to shade into recognition of what was happening, and she spoke calmly despite the eyes of every first-class passenger now fixed on this confrontation. "I haven't created any disturbance. I boarded, showed my ticket, and took my assigned seat. I think there's been some misunderstanding." But Captain Richard Hayes wasn't interested in explanations, his face showing the kind of certainty that comes from years of being obeyed without question, and he gestured toward the exit with barely concealed impatience. "Ma'am, I'm the captain of this aircraft, and I make the final decisions about who flies. Multiple crew members have expressed concerns about your behavior during boarding, and I'm exercising my authority to deny you passage on this flight. Now please exit voluntarily, or I'll call security to assist your removal." Lisa's jaw tightened because she knew exactly what concerns about her behavior meant, knew that the only behavior she'd exhibited was being a black woman in first class who'd politely declined when a flight attendant had suggested she might prefer a seat toward the back of the plane where it was less crowded, despite first class being only half full, who'd calmly corrected another crew member who'd assumed she was traveling on an employee buddy pass rather than a paying passenger, who'd committed the unforgivable sin of existing in a premium cabin while black and not performing sufficient deference or gratitude for being allowed to occupy space she'd paid for. She could have told Captain Hayes that she'd been flying for 15 years, that she held every rating and certification the FAA offered, that she logged over 8,000 flight hours across 4 continents, that she worked for this exact airline and held the same rank he did. But his body language and his tone told her that explanations would be futile, that he'd already decided what story he believed, and no amount of evidence would change his mind until he was forced to confront it. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor before I deplane," Lisa said, her voice still controlled but now carrying an edge that made several passengers lean forward with interest. "I haven't violated any regulations, I haven't created any disturbance, and I believe I'm being asked to leave based on discriminatory assumptions rather than any legitimate safety concern." Captain Hayes's face flushed red, and he pulled out his radio with theatrical flourish. "That's exactly the kind of attitude I'm talking about, questioning crew authority and making accusations instead of complying with reasonable requests. Security, the gate 15. We have a non-compliant passenger refusing to deplane." Lisa watched him make the call, watched nearby passengers pull out phones to record, watched flight attendants hover uncertainly in the galley as if they sensed this situation was spiraling in a direction no one had anticipated, and she made a decision about how to handle what came next. She reached into her jacket pocket slowly and deliberately, making sure her movements were visible and non-threatening, because she'd learned that black people reaching for anything could be interpreted as aggression by people looking for excuses to escalate. And she pulled out a leather credential holder that she flipped open to reveal her airline identification card with her photo, her employee number, and most importantly, the 4 stripes on her uniform in the picture that designated her rank as captain. "My name is Captain Lisa Morgan, employee number 47382. I'm a senior captain with this airline with 15 years of service and over 8,000 flight hours. I'm currently traveling on my day off to visit family, and what you've just done is call security to remove one of your fellow captains based on reports of concerning behavior that I can guarantee boils down to crew members being uncomfortable with a black woman in first class who didn't act sufficiently grateful for being allowed to sit in a seat she paid for." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ambient sounds of the aircraft and the distant noise of the terminal. and Lisa watched Captain Hayes's face cycle through emotions too quickly to catalog. Confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally, a sickly pale realization that he'd just committed a catastrophic error in judgment that was being recorded by multiple passengers and would almost certainly define the end of his career. His mouth opened and closed without sound, and Lisa continued in that same calm, controlled voice that she used in the cockpit when managing emergencies, the tone that communicated absolute authority without raising volume or losing composure. Let me walk you through what just happened here. Your crew made assumptions about me based on my appearance. They questioned my right to be in first class despite my valid ticket. They suggested I move to a different section despite there being no legitimate reason for such a request. And when I politely declined and corrected their misunderstandings about my ticket type, they apparently reported me to you as a disruptive passenger. You then approached me with the preconceived notion that I was a problem that needed to be removed. You didn't ask for my side of the story. You didn't investigate the claims before acting. You didn't even verify whether I'd actually done anything wrong. You simply accepted that a black woman in first class must be causing problems and exercised your captain's authority to have me removed. Other passengers were nodding, and a man across the aisle spoke up. She's absolutely right. I've been sitting here since boarding started, and I watched the entire interaction. Your flight attendants were rude to her from the moment she stepped on the plane. They questioned her ticket, suggested she move to economy, made comments about employee passes, and she handled all of it with more patience than they deserved. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't cause a scene, she just politely insisted on sitting in the seat she'd paid for. And now you're trying to remove her for the crime of not being sufficiently submissive when your crew was being discriminatory? Several other passengers added their agreement, and Lisa saw Captain Hayes's certainty crumble completely as he realized the witnesses were not going to support the narrative he'd been fed by his crew. Airport security arrived, two officers who looked prepared for conflict but whose expressions shifted to confusion as they took in the scene. A woman in professional attire, calmly holding an airline captain's ID, while the pilot who'd called them stood frozen with obvious distress. "What's the situation here?" one of the security officers asked, directing his question to Captain Hayes, who seemed to have lost the ability to form coherent sentences. Lisa answered instead, her voice clear and professional. "The situation is that I'm Captain Lisa Morgan. I work for this airline. I was boarding as a passenger on my day off when crew members made discriminatory assumptions about my right to be in first class, and when I politely corrected those assumptions, they reported me to Captain Hayes here as a disruptive passenger. He then attempted to have me removed from the aircraft without investigating whether the complaints had any merit. And approximately 2 minutes ago, I informed him that I'm actually a fellow captain with this airline, at which point he realized he'd made a significant error in judgment." The security officers looked at Captain Hayes for confirmation, and he managed a nod that looked like it caused him physical pain. One of the officers turned to Lisa with obvious respect. "Captain Morgan, do you wish to file a complaint about how you were treated?" Lisa considered the question. Looking at Captain Hayes, who appeared to be mentally calculating how much damage control would be required to salvage his career. Looking at the flight attendants, who were now conspicuously absent from the cabin. Looking at the passengers, who had witnessed everything and were still recording. "Yes, I'll be filing a formal complaint with both the airline and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, because what happened here wasn't just poor customer service, it was discrimination against an employee based on race, and it reveals systemic problems with how this airline's crew members are trained to recognize and challenge their own biases." She turned to address Captain Hayes directly. "You made assumptions about who I was based purely on my appearance. You accepted complaints about my behavior without verification. You exercised your authority to remove me without due process. And you did all of this because somewhere in your training or your experience or your personal belief system, you learned that black women in first class are probably problems that need to be solved, rather than passengers or colleagues deserving of respect. An airline supervisor had arrived, a woman whose face showed she'd already been briefed on the situation, and who immediately approached Lisa with visible anxiety. "Captain Morgan, I'm Jennifer Walsh, the station manager. I cannot adequately apologize for what you've experienced. This is completely unacceptable, and we will conduct a full investigation into how this situation developed." Lisa looked at her with an expression that suggested apologies were noted, but insufficient. "Jennifer, I've worked for this airline for 15 years. I've flown safely through storms and emergencies and mechanical failures. I've trained new pilots and mentored crew members and represented this company at industry events. And today, I was nearly removed from a flight by one of my fellow captains because crew members decided my presence in first class was suspicious. So an investigation and an apology aren't enough. I want mandatory anti-bias training for all crew members. I want clear protocols for how discrimination complaints are investigated before passengers are removed. I want transparency about how many other passengers of color have been removed from flights based on vague reports of concerning behavior that really meant they didn't act sufficiently deferential to crew authority. By the time the situation was resolved and a different crew was brought in to operate the flight, with profuse apologies to all passengers for the delay, Lisa found herself sitting in the same seat she'd originally occupied, while Captain Hayes had been removed from duty pending investigation, and the crew members who'd made the initial complaints were being interviewed by supervisors. Fellow passengers approached her throughout the boarding process to express support and offer witness statements, and several told her stories about their own experiences with discrimination, or times they'd witnessed others being treated unfairly but hadn't known how to intervene effectively. And Lisa realized that this incident, as painful and exhausting as it had become a teaching moment about bias and authority and the courage required to challenge both. What you just witnessed wasn't just about one pilot making one bad decision. It was about how authority figures often accept discriminatory complaints without investigation when those complaints align with their own biases. About how black professionals can have stellar credentials and extensive experience and still be treated as suspicious or undeserving when they occupy spaces that don't match observers' expectations. About how racism operates through the casual acceptance of reports that a black woman is causing problems without anyone asking what problems or verifying whether the complaints have any factual basis. Captain Lisa Morgan has 15 years of flying experience, holds the highest ratings available, has safely transported thousands of passengers, and works for the exact airline whose pilot tried to have her removed based purely on crew complaints that she wasn't sufficiently submissive when questioned about her right to sit in first class. And Captain Hayes never considered that the disruptive passenger might actually be a colleague, might have legitimate grievances about discriminatory treatment, might deserve the same due process and benefit of doubt that would automatically be extended to white passengers facing similar complaints. The heartbreaking reality is that Lisa's credentials and her airline ID were the only things that made Captain Hayes and his crew recognize their error, which means their apologies weren't about understanding that discrimination is wrong regardless of who experiences it, but about fear of consequences for discriminating against someone with institutional power. And that distinction reveals everything about whether this incident will lead to actual cultural change or just more careful targeting of victims who can't fight back as effectively. If this story made you angry, if you felt protective of Lisa and horrified that a captain tried to remove a fellow captain based on discriminatory complaints he never investigated, use those feelings to examine how often you accept reports about people causing problems without questioning whether those reports might reflect the reporter's biases rather than the accused person's actual behavior. how often you assume that authority figures have good reasons for their decisions, even when those decisions disproportionately target people of color. How often you stay silent when you witness discrimination because intervening feels uncomfortable or risky. Share this video because it illustrates that professional achievement and institutional status don't protect Black people from being treated as suspicious when they occupy spaces where their presence challenges observers' assumptions about who belongs where. They just occasionally provide tools to demand accountability after the harm has already occurred. Comment below with your own experiences of being treated as suspicious or disruptive when you're actually just existing while Black in spaces where someone decided you didn't belong, or times when you witnessed others being removed or disciplined based on vague complaints that seem to reflect bias rather than behavior, because documenting these patterns makes it harder for institutions to dismiss them as isolated misunderstandings. Subscribe if you believe that authority figures should investigate complaints before acting on them, that Black professionals deserve the same benefit of doubt that white colleagues receive automatically, that the next generation of Black pilots and passengers should be able to travel without fear that their presence will trigger discriminatory assumptions disguised as safety concerns. And most importantly, be the passenger who records evidence and offers witness statements when you see someone being treated unfairly, who challenges authority when that authority is being exercised discriminatorily, who refuses to let institutions sweep incidents under bureaucratic carpets with apologies that protect perpetrators over victims, because your documentation and support can transform individual incidents into patterns that demand systemic accountability and cultural transformation that protects everyone, rather than just those with institutional power to fight back.